Matthew Carter had everything money could buy: an $8 million penthouse in Manhattan's Upper East Side, 3 luxury cars, a 7-figure bank account. But that March evening, sitting on the nursery floor with a screaming infant in his arms, the 38-year-old CEO of CarterTech was crying harder than he had since he was 12 years old. It was 3 in the morning. His wife Sarah had been hospitalized in a psychiatric facility for a week with a severe nervous breakdown. The baby was only 6 months old and hadn't stopped crying for hours. Matthew had tried everything: bottles, diaper changes, lullabies, walks. But nothing worked. He was at the edge of total collapse. That's when the new nanny, a 55-year-old woman named Margaret Hayes, quietly entered the room. She knelt beside him and whispered 3 words that would change his life forever. Words that no employee, no consultant, no friend had ever dared to tell him. Words that would shatter the empire he'd built with obsession, but would save the only thing that truly mattered: his family. The Carter penthouse on Park Avenue was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, Scandinavian designer furniture, a meticulously maintained Zen garden on the terrace. But that February morning, the home felt more like a mausoleum than a residence. Matthew Carter woke at 5:30, as he had every day for the past 15 years. 38 years old, perfectly styled hair, a physique maintained by 3 personal training sessions per week. CarterTech, the software company he'd founded at 23 with $10,000 in savings, was now worth $120 million. 300 employees, offices in 4 countries, Fortune 500 clients. Success had come at a price. His first marriage had failed at 29. His wife had said he was married to his work, not to her. Friendships had dissolved from lack of time. His father had died without him present because he was in a meeting too important to interrupt. 3 years ago, he'd met Sarah, beautiful, intelligent, 28, a successful architect with her own firm, a woman who seemed to understand his ambition, who had the same priorities. They'd married after 6 months of dating in a $200,000 ceremony in the Hamptons. The first year had been perfect. 2 brilliant careers, dinners at the finest restaurants, weekends in Paris and London. Then Sarah had gotten pregnant. It wasn't planned, but they'd both welcomed the news with enthusiasm. After all, they were entering the next phase of life, where successful people like them formed perfect families. The pregnancy had been difficult. Sarah had complications that forced her to bed rest for 3 months. But Matthew had been too busy with an important acquisition to really notice how stressed she was. He'd hired a private nurse, thinking money solved the problem. Tommy was born 6 months ago, an emergency C-section that left Sarah traumatized. The baby was healthy, beautiful, but demanding. He cried a lot, slept little. Sarah, who had always been in control of everything, found herself completely overwhelmed. Matthew had done what he knew how to do best. He'd tried to solve the problem with resources: full-time nannies, sleep consultants at $500 an hour, every baby gadget on the market. But nothing seemed to work, and he continued going to the office, because there he knew what to do. There he had control. The crack in the perfect facade had started 3 months earlier. Sarah had shown signs of postpartum depression, but Matthew had hired a private psychologist instead of being present. Then, 2 weeks ago, the incident happened. Matthew had come home at 11 at night and found Sarah sitting on the kitchen floor, the baby crying in the bassinet beside her, completely dissociated. She didn't respond when he called her. She just stared into space. The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes. Sarah was admitted to a private psychiatric clinic in Connecticut. Severe nervous breakdown, dissociation, risk of self-harm. The doctors said she needed weeks, maybe months, of intensive treatment. Suddenly, Matthew found himself alone with a 6-month-old infant, with no idea what to do. The nannies he'd hired kept quitting after a few days. Tommy seemed to sense their uncertainty and cried even more. It was Matthew's personal assistant who suggested Margaret Hayes, a traditional nanny, 55 years old, who had raised 4 children of her own and worked with dozens of families over the past 30 years. She didn't have fancy certifications or cutting-edge methods. She just had experience and cost $60 an hour instead of $120. Matthew, desperate, had accepted. Margaret arrived that March morning, a sturdy woman with gray hair, strong hands, kind but firm eyes. She wasn't impressed by the penthouse, the cars, the money. She looked Matthew straight in the eye and said she would help the baby. But there were conditions. Matthew, accustomed to giving orders not receiving them, was surprised. But he was too desperate to argue. He had no idea that what Margaret was about to ask of him couldn't be bought with any amount of money. Margaret Hayes had seen many wealthy families in her 30 years as a nanny. She'd worked for entrepreneurs, politicians, famous athletes. She knew the pattern. Parents obsessed with success, trying to buy solutions to emotional problems. Children raised by paid strangers. Marriages collapsing under the weight of ambition. But there was something about the Carter home that particularly struck her. It wasn't just the absence of warmth. It was the complete absence of traces of family life. No family photos, no toys out of place, no disorder indicating that a baby lived there. Tommy's nursery was designed like a magazine spread. Expensive crib, minimalist white furniture, perfectly clean gray carpet. But it lacked everything that makes a nursery welcoming. Colors, softness, the loving chaos of baby things. Margaret began working quietly. The first day, she just observed. She saw Matthew checking his phone every 3 minutes, how he held the baby rigidly, as if he were a fragile object that might break, how every cry made him stiffen with panic instead of responding with calm. But she said nothing. Not yet. She waited, observed, built trust with Tommy, who, finally feeling secure hands and a calm presence, slowly began to relax. On the 3rd day, Matthew came home at 8 in the evening and found Margaret softly singing to Tommy in the kitchen, preparing simple soup with one hand while cradling the baby with the other. Matthew suddenly felt out of place in his own home. That night, at 11, Margaret knocked on his study door. She had Tommy asleep against her chest, in a wrap. She said they needed to talk. Margaret didn't waste time. She told him the problem wasn't the baby. Tommy was a normal, healthy infant who just needed routine, warmth, and presence. The problem was that he had none of these things. Matthew began defending himself, listing everything he'd done: expensive nannies, consultants, the best equipment. But Margaret interrupted with gentle firmness. All the money in the world, she explained, doesn't replace a present parent. Sarah had gotten sick because she'd tried to do everything alone while he was absent. The nannies left because a baby senses when he's considered a problem to solve instead of a person to love. Matthew felt anger rising. Who was this woman to tell him how to live his life? He'd built an empire, guaranteed a luxury life for his son. How dare she judge him? But Margaret continued with a calm voice, but firm eyes. His son didn't need another paid employee. He needed his father. And if he didn't find a way to be present, Tommy would grow up rich, but empty, just like him. The silence that followed was thick. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever dared tell him he was failing at the most important thing. He wanted to fire her on the spot. But he looked at Tommy, sleeping peacefully against Margaret's chest, something he'd never done with him, and the words died in his throat. Margaret made her proposal. She would continue working, but under specific conditions. Matthew had to take leave from work. Not a week, at least 3 months. He had to learn to be a father, not a CEO who delegated fatherhood. Matthew laughed bitterly. 3 months? The company needed him. But Margaret shook her head. The company had survived before him and would survive after. His son had only one father and only one childhood. His wife needed to see he was willing to change, or she would never truly heal. That night, Matthew couldn't sleep. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. Was it true? Was he empty? He had everything: success, money, recognition. But when was the last time he'd been truly happy? The crisis came 3 days later. Matthew had promised to think about Margaret's proposal, but he'd done nothing. He kept going to the office, kept the meetings, kept convincing himself he could handle everything. That evening, there was an important dinner with Japanese investors, a $20 million deal. But at 7 o'clock, Margaret received a call. Her daughter had been in a car accident. Nothing serious, but she had to go to the hospital immediately. Matthew felt panic rising. He couldn't cancel the dinner. He couldn't leave Tommy alone. Finally, he had to bring the baby with him, planning to put him to sleep in an adjoining room during dinner. The dinner started well. The investors were impressed. The food excellent. Tommy was sleeping. But at 9:30, in the middle of the most important financial presentation, Tommy woke up and started crying. Matthew tried everything. Bottle refused. Diaper change wasn't it. Rocking made it worse. He returned to the dining room with Tommy in his arms, still crying, trying to continue the presentation. The investors were polite, but visibly uncomfortable. Matthew felt control slipping away. His voice trembled. The numbers he'd memorized perfectly confused in his mind. He was sweating, shaking, feeling the world collapse. At 10 o'clock, the head of the Japanese delegation stood up. Matthew thought he was leaving, but instead the man approached, extended his arms, and with a gesture asked if he could hold the baby. Surprised, Matthew passed him over. The investor cradled Tommy with expert movements, humming softly. Slowly, miraculously, the baby calmed down. The man looked at Matthew with kind eyes. He said he had 3 children and 7 grandchildren, that he knew how to recognize a baby who simply wanted to be held, and a father who had forgotten how to be present. Then he added something that hit Matthew in the heart. When his oldest son was this age,
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
he'd lost a big deal because he chose to stay with him instead of in a meeting. Today, that baby was his best friend and worked with him. The deal he'd lost? He didn't even remember it anymore. The dinner ended without the deal. $20 million lost. But when he returned home with Tommy finally asleep in his arms, something had changed. That night, at 3 in the morning, when Tommy woke up crying, instead of calling Margaret, Matthew picked him up. He tried everything, but nothing worked. The baby kept screaming. And suddenly, Matthew began to cry. Not silent tears, but deep sobs. He cried for the father he'd lost while in a meeting, for the failed marriage, for Sarah in the hospital, for the baby he didn't know, for the life he'd thrown away, chasing empty success. That's when Margaret quietly entered. She knelt beside him and whispered 3 words that changed everything. "You're not alone." Then she added that he didn't have to have all the answers, didn't have to have control. He just had to be there, present, imperfect, human. That was all his son wanted, all Sarah wanted, all that truly mattered. And in that moment, sitting on the floor crying with a screaming infant in his arms, Matthew Carter finally understood what he'd lost, chasing success. And he decided, for the first time in 38 years, to choose something different. Monday morning, Matthew did something he'd never done. He called his vice president and said he was taking a leave. 3 months, effective immediately. The first weeks were the hardest of his life, harder than building a company from scratch, harder than any negotiation, because he couldn't control anything, couldn't solve an infant with strategies or plans. Margaret taught him with infinite patience. She showed him how to recognize different cries, how to give a bath, change diapers, prepare bottles at the right temperature, things he'd always delegated, thinking they were beneath him. But most of all, Margaret taught him to be present, to turn off the phone, not to think about the future or past, but about this moment, this baby, this breath, this embrace. Matthew visited Sarah in the hospital every afternoon, bringing Tommy. At first she was still distant, medicated, traumatized, but seeing Matthew hold the baby with growing confidence, change him, feed him, play with him, something in her eyes changed. The healing process was slow. Sarah had months of therapy ahead, but for the first time, there was real hope, because Matthew was demonstrating with actions, not words, that things were different. Meanwhile, something strange was happening at CarterTech. The company didn't collapse without Matthew. In fact, it seemed to function better. The vice president made decisions Matthew had always centralized. Middle managers flourished, having more autonomy. Innovation increased because people no longer feared contradicting the omnipresent CEO. After 2 months, Sarah came home. She was still fragile, still in therapy, but wanted to try. Margaret stayed to help with the transition, no longer as the person who did everything, but as support while Matthew and Sarah learned together. There were difficult moments, nights when Tommy cried for hours, days when Sarah collapsed again, moments when Matthew felt the temptation to flee to work. But Margaret was there, reminding him he wasn't alone, didn't have to be perfect, just present. Slowly, the Carter home changed. Family photos appeared, colorful toys invaded the minimalist living room, the Zen garden became a play area. The perfect magazine-worthy penthouse became a lived-in home, chaotic, full of life. Matthew discovered things about himself he didn't know. That he loved singing silly lullabies to Tommy. That laughing at the chaos of an exploded diaper could be more satisfying than closing $1 million deal. That watching his son discover his own hands was more interesting than any corporate presentation. He also discovered who Sarah really was. Not the perfect trophy wife, but an intelligent, funny, deep woman who had sacrificed everything trying to maintain the facade of perfection he demanded. They talked for the first time, really. Not about superficialities, but about fears, dreams, failures. And together, slowly, painfully, they began to build something real. When Matthew returned to the office after 3 months, he was a different man. Physically, he looked younger. He'd slept more, stressed less, laughed much. But the deepest change was in his eyes. There was a calm that had never been there, a presence that transcended constant urgency. He called a company-wide meeting. He looked at the 300 employees and did something unexpected. He apologized. He apologized for creating a toxic culture where work came before life, where being present at 8 in the evening was normal, where taking sick days was seen as weakness. He announced radical changes. No emails after 6 in the evening. No meetings Friday afternoon. Extended parental leave of 3 months fully paid. Free psychological support for all employees. The first weeks were chaotic. Matthew worked only 8 hours a day, 9 to 5, with an actual lunch break. He came home for dinner with the family. He didn't check emails at night. Some clients complained. A big deal almost fell through because Matthew refused to call at 7 in the evening. The board expressed concerns. Investors murmured he was going soft, but Matthew held firm. And something interesting happened. Employees, seeing the CEO respect boundaries, began doing the same. Productivity increased. Rested people worked better. Innovation exploded. Having time to think brought better ideas. After 6 months, the numbers spoke clearly. Stable profits, employee satisfaction through the roof, turnover down 80%. The best talent in the sector wanted to work at CarterTech because it had a reputation for treating people well. But there were losses. 3 board members resigned. Some clients went to competitors. An old CEO friend called to tell him he'd gone soft, that he was throwing away everything they'd worked for. Matthew listened, then responded that he'd thrown away the obsession that was destroying his family, the ego that told him he had to control everything, the illusion that professional success equals a full life. And he was happier than he'd ever been. At home, the transformation continued. Matthew and Sarah went to couples therapy every week. It wasn't easy. Years of dysfunctional patterns didn't disappear in 6 months. But they were committed. Margaret was still with them, no longer as a full-time nanny, but as family. She came 3 times a week, more like an adopted grandmother than an employee. Matthew discovered her story. She'd lost her husband young, raised 4 children alone, working as a nanny, had seen hundreds of wealthy families destroy themselves. One day, Matthew asked why she dared tell him the truth that night, risking being fired. Margaret smiled and said at 75 years old she didn't need money anymore, and she preferred sleeping well, knowing she'd told the truth. Tommy, now 1-year-old, thrived. He was a happy, secure, loved child. He laughed often, slept well, explored the world with joy. Sarah had returned to work part-time, slowly rebuilding her architecture career, but with different priorities. Not to prove anything to anyone, but from genuine passion. And with a husband who truly supported, who took Tommy when she had deadlines. 2 years after that March night, when Matthew had cried on the floor, the Carter penthouse was unrecognizable, not in size or elegance, but in soul. It had become a home where people lived, laughed, cried, grew. Matthew looked back on those 2 years as the most important transformation of his life. He'd built a $120 million company, but had almost destroyed a family in the process. And then he'd learned, painfully, slowly, that true success isn't measured in revenues. CarterTech continued to thrive, but differently. Matthew had promoted the vice president to co-CEO, truly sharing power. He'd refused 3 acquisitions that would have required constant travel. He'd sold shares to free up time, not to increase capital. Some in the industry considered him a failure, but others saw him as visionary. The first high-profile CEO to demonstrate you could have professional success without sacrificing personal life. Matthew began speaking publicly about his experience. Conferences where he talked not about business strategies, but about how he'd almost lost everything chasing success. Reactions were mixed, but the letters he received from fathers who'd recognized themselves in his story told him he was making a difference. Margaret, now 77, had become an integral part of the family. Tommy called her Grandma Margaret and ran to hug her every time she arrived. Sarah considered her a friend, mentor, mother figure. One day, during a family dinner, Matthew raised his glass. He said 2 years ago he thought he was successful because he had money, power, recognition, but he was empty, alone, lost. Now, looking around the table, Sarah laughing, Tommy making a mess with pasta, Margaret smiling with kind eyes, he knew what it meant to truly be rich. That evening, after putting Tommy to bed together, singing silly songs and reading stories, Matthew sat on the couch with Sarah. They looked at old photos from 2 years ago. Their perfect but empty faces, the perfect but cold home, the perfect but dead life. And then recent photos, chaotic, imperfect, full of spontaneous moments. Real, chaotic, beautiful life. Sarah rested her head on Matthew's shoulder and whispered if he was happy. Matthew didn't have to think. For the first time in 38 years, the answer was simple, immediate, true. Yes, he wasn't happy because he had money or success. He was happy because at 6:30 he was home, because he knew his son's laugh, because his wife looked at him with real love, because he'd learned that being vulnerable wasn't weakness, but the bravest thing a man could do. The $8 million penthouse was still there. The luxury cars, too. The bank account hadn't collapsed. But none of this really mattered. What mattered was Sarah's hand in his, Tommy's peaceful breathing in the next room, the awareness that tomorrow he'd wake up not to conquer the world, but to have breakfast with his family. The true millionaire, Matthew understood that evening, wasn't who had the most money. It was who had understood, before it was too late, that the greatest treasure was time. Time with those you love. Time to be present. Time to build memories that no bank account could ever buy. And as Tommy slept, dreaming happy child dreams, surrounded by the imperfect but real love of parents who had chosen to be present, Matthew closed his eyes and for the first time in years slept deeply, without anxiety, without regrets, simply grateful to be alive, to be here, to be finally truly rich. Like if you believe true success is measured in love, not money. Comment if you know someone who sacrificed family for career. Share this story with those who work too much and live too little. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Sometimes the most important words aren't spoken in boardrooms or press conferences. They're whispered at 3 in the morning by someone who has the courage to tell the truth. And if you're brave enough to listen, those words can save not just your life, but your soul.